All I've ever wanted to be in life is Wolverine. Ha! Welcome to Module 8, Lecture 20. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about Chapter 10 in the Goldstein and Peevehouse textbook on international integration. In the modern world, and you'll notice this is a running theme throughout the lectures in this course, we have a split between the competing interests on the one hand of nationalism and state sovereignty versus the need to address global issues through supranational entities. And this is something that we are seeing time and time again with the emergence of international institutions and the blowback that these institutions get from states that want to continue to proceed in the way that they feel is most appropriate, but while recognizing that some issues traverse national boundaries and therefore need to be dealt with on a more global level. So let's talk about integration theory. What is international integration? It is the process by which supranational institutions begin to replace national ones. This challenges realist assumptions that states are unitary actors that will never concede power or sovereignty to anything else. And the most successful example, although it certainly has hit its bumps in the recent months, is the European Union. So integration happens, but why? Well, it can be explained by what's called functionalism. And this is where we see the growth of specialized technical organizations that cross national borders. So as connections between states become denser and flows become faster, we need new institutions that deliver specific necessary functions, because states on their own simply are incapable of addressing these new global challenges. A variant of this is what's called neo-functionalism. And this is where economic integration requires more political coordination. That may be in the form of new supranational institutions or other kinds of organizations, but it's this more specific and recent variant of functionalism in that the output from a cognizance of the emerging interdependence between states is more political coordination and perhaps more political institutions that are at the supranational level of governance. So, as we've talked about the exemplar of functionalism, the European Union, let's see how we got to where we are now. So it began in 1952 as the European Coal and Steel Community, and it was designed to reduce trade barriers in only these two specific industries, coal and steel, and to coordinate policies, because these countries are relatively small, and there was a need to try and harmonize the laws between these countries to make trade even more adaptable to the fact that there was more need within the European Union, or what would later become the European Union, for the kinds of inputs to important aspects of their economy that these countries were desperately needing. So this was a way to kind of streamline the political end of things so that it would be easier to obtain coal and steel within the community. This was followed up by the formation of what was called the European Defense Community. And it worked to try and integrate Europe's military forces under a single budget and command, but the world wasn't ready for this, and it ultimately failed when France failed to ratify, Britain refused to join, so it was kind of dead in the water. Then we have the real formal adoption of a law or an international treaty that began the European Union as we understand it today in earnest, and that was in 1957. It established, among other things, the European Atomic Energy Community, or Euratom. It created the European Economic Community, which was later renamed the European Community. It formed a customs union and a common market, for example, the Common Agricultural Policy. And these are both different kinds of organizations that harmonize the laws within and among the countries, and then also coordinate what kinds of laws all of the states are going to agree to outside of their region. And they developed an economic and monetary union, the EMU, which then birthed the Eurodollar. So here's just a map to give you a sense of how the European Union has expanded since its founding in 1957. And you can see it kind of began in some of the larger Western European countries and has since really spread north and east. Okay, so what about The structure of the European Union itself. Well, it's kind of complicated, but I'll highlight some of the most important points. So you have a European Commission, right? And the job of the European Commission is to identify problems and propose solutions to the Council of the European Union. Then the Council of the European Union is made up of different ministers from each of the member states. So the composition of the Council of the European Union changes depending on the issue area. There might be agricultural ministers in one meeting, and then the Council of the EU might be defense ministers in another. So it's always kind of a revolving door of the ministers who are relevant to a specific issue area. And then there's a parliament, which is sort of a quasi-legislative body that's meant to provide a watchdog on the European Commission, but it sort of shares power with the Council of the European Union. And the European Commission is made up of members from each of the individual states. Then you have the European Council, which is composed of the leaders of the members of the European Union. And then kind of at the bottom of that, you have the Court of Justice, which functions in a way that's somewhat similar to the Supreme Court in the United States, in the sense that the justices that serve on that court can make statements, legal pronouncements, and decisions regarding individual laws of EU member countries and adjudicate matters that relate to EU law. So the Court of Justice can actually strike down individual state laws that conflict with EU level law, which is kind of like what we have in our Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court can review federal laws, but it can also strike down state laws as well. And so just to give you a sense of how that kind of compares, here is the US system where we have our three branches of government, right? The legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And there are varying relationships to other aspects of government like the Supreme Court, like the cabinet, and so on. So the last thing we're going to conclude with here when we're talking about integration is information. Globalization has brought unprecedented levels and forms of transnational communication, but it hasn't been evenly spread across the world. There's unequal access that persists when we're thinking about new forms of technology and telecommunications. So this gap between the global north and the global south, the developed and the developing countries, has been called the digital divide. So here's one kind of way we can look at this. This is a map of the world that shows the number and percentage of internet users per country. And you can see if you look on the left, the United States has roughly 227 million or so internet users, although this graphic came from a couple years ago, which roughly represents 3/4 of the people who live in the United States. Now, compare that to China, for example. China has, at this point, probably well over 300 million internet users, but that only constitutes less than 1/4 of the people in their country. So in terms of the actual percentage of people who have access to the internet, even though the numbers, the actual raw numbers might be higher, the percentage within these societies is still dramatically different across them. Another way to look at this is the bandwidth from the internets in terms of gigabytes per second. And this is a really kind of simple graph, but it shows you the differences between the developed and developing world. And you can see that over time, the developed world has exponentially increased its capacity to process and transmit information, whereas that progress has been a lot slower in the developing world. So even though the same technology actually exists, the speed with which it is adopted and the speed that people within these countries can enjoy is definitely different depending on whether you are in a developed country or a developing country.